A story. Prince Siddhartha and the Four Signs. 3rd century BCE, based on an older tradition. And I preface this story with this image. It's a stone relief carving of an image from the story we are about to read. Siddhartha sees an old man, and you can see the old man sitting on the right-hand side of the image. Siddhartha is sitting in the carriage here. Sometimes in my classes, during week one, I challenge students to guess the places where philosophy began. As noted at the very start of class, philosophy is a relatively late development in civilization. It doesn't begin, people don't start philosophizing until a number of developments are in place. First, the people of a nation must be settled and sedentary. That is, they should be farmers tied to a particular piece of land, not hunter-gathering nomads. They must have enough food and resources to live comfortably. They should have plenty to eat and not be struggling to survive hand to mouth. Things like an army are a good idea too. The army can protect the people, and there can be a whole number of citizens who devote their lives to studying, reading, thinking, and learning, and thus, can leave the fighting to others. And finally, a nation should have writing, which, as we have seen, preserves the words, thoughts, ideas, and teachings of the wisest citizens so that later generations can learn from them even after their deaths. For writing allows the dead to speak and their thoughts to live again. And just a reminder, here is an image of the Egyptian god Thoth, who invented writing. Early in this class, we suggested that philosophy might have begun in Egypt, or perhaps grew out of a conversation between Egypt and Greece, emerging from the sharing of ideas and cultures as people traveled back and forth across the Mediterranean Sea. For Egypt especially, certainly had all of the things I just mentioned, all the things necessary for philosophy to develop. Egypt was fed by the Nile River, her lush banks providing ample farmland and an abundance of wheat, making for both bread and beer for its people. The Egyptians had more than enough food, which meant they had food enough to support people who didn't farm. An army, for one thing, but also scholars. Egypt had all the necessary ingredients for the development and preservation of wisdom, mythology, religion, and philosophy. But aside from Egypt and Greece, philosophy also got its start in other parts of the world too, in other places with established civilizations. It didn't happen often, but it did happen more than once over the course of humankind's history. So in addition to Egypt and Greece, when I'm kind of counting Egypt and Greece together as one thing, they're just right across the sea from each other, and there were boats going back and forth. We can find philosophy in ancient China, Persia, today Iran, and India, where philosophy developed at around the same time it did in Egypt and Greece, which is a rather interesting thing to wonder about, right? Why is it that at three different times, sorry, why is it at three different places, all at the same time, people started thinking? And so for this class, I'd like to look at one of India's most important thinkers, as I think it connects well with our recent discussion on the good life and our consideration of the question, what is the best way to live? The story of this thinker's life is as interesting as his teaching, and in many ways they are one and the same thing. And a lot like the story of Plato's cave, it's one of the great stories we can all connect with and relate to, and which resonates with us all. Best of all, we can begin the story like a fairy tale, while remembering that myths are not lies, for they speak the truth, even when they are not literally true. The story might begin this way. Once upon a time, there was a prince. His name was Siddhartha, and he lived in a kingdom north of India called Kosala. Prince Siddhartha lived a life of luxury and pleasure. His father, the king, was determined that Siddhartha would never want for anything, and so he, for lack of a better word, spoiled him, catering to his every desire while ensuring that he never suffered or knew any discomfort. So here is a look at Prince Siddhartha's life. Delicious fruits and food, bottle of wine, perfume, and beautiful musicians to entertain him. An ancient Buddhist text, the Sukhamala Sutta, Sutta is an ancient Indian scripture, supports to give us Siddhartha's story in his own words. And so for the rest of this part of the class, I will retell his story while occasionally quoting directly from the sutta or scripture that recounts it. Because writing is a kind of time travel, we can take our imaginary time machine and travel back to the 6th century BCE and hear what happened from a writer who may have been the very person the story is about. And even if it wasn't really written by Siddhartha, our earlier discussion of myth reminds us that sometimes stories themselves are important, whether they really happened or not. When the prince was born, the king called all 8 of his priests to come to the baby's bedside and asked them to predict what his future would be. 7 of the 8 declared that the prince would grow up to be a great king like his father, but the 8th said something different. He said that when the boy grew up, he would renounce his throne, renounce his wealth, and renounce his position, and become a monk. The king, determined to make sure that his son lived the life he wanted for him, that of a great king, decided to prevent this from happening and keep his son safe from all the evils of the world, lest he be moved by some spirit of compassion for the suffering outside the palace walls, and comfortable, giving him everything a young man could desire growing up. Again, delicious food, wine, perfume, and beautiful musicians to entertain him. Speaking of his childhood, Siddhartha remarks in the Sukhamala Sutta, I lived in refinement, utmost refinement, total refinement. My father even had lotus ponds made in our palace, one where red lotuses bloomed, one where white lotuses bloomed, one where blue lotuses bloomed, all for my sake. A white sunshade was held over me day and night to protect me from cold, heat, dust, dirt, and dew. I had 3 palaces, one for the cold season, one for the hot season, and one for the rainy season. During the 4 months of the rainy season, I was entertained in the rainy season palace by minstrels without a single man among them. Those were the beautiful women who sang and entertained him. And I did not once come down from the palace. Whereas the servants, workers, and retainers in other people's homes were fed meals of lentil soup and broken rice. In my father's home, the servants, workers, and retainers were fed wheat, rice, and meat. So Siddhartha's father's servants ate better than most of the people who were not servants. But there's a problem with getting everything you want. You will eventually get bored. And young Prince Siddhartha, though comfortable and with his every desire catered to, indeed became bored. Against his father's wishes, he did the unthinkable and he snuck out of the palace one day in the disguise as a commoner to explore the city that had been just outside his door his entire life. So here is Siddhartha leaving his palace. And it was during this time outside the palace that Prince Siddhartha saw the 4 sights, 4 things that changed his life, perspective, and understanding about what really matters and what really does not matter in life. There are many versions of what Siddhartha saw on that first journey outside the palace walls. According to one 3rd century account, the gods placed 4 sights in front of him to show him what life was really like for the people who had been hidden from him his entire life. And here is an image depicting the things that Siddhartha saw. Interestingly, this picture shows Siddhartha in a carriage being like pulled by dozens of servants. Okay, but the story we have sees him sneaking out of the palace like in disguise. So these don't really fit together, but I guess it's okay. You still understand the story. You can see the 3 things that Siddhartha saw outside the palace walls. 1, 2, and 3. And I'll talk about the 3 things, and then there will be a 4th thing later. I'll talk about the first 3 things right now. The first sight that greeted Prince Siddhartha was that of an old man, the first old man Siddhartha had ever seen. So here's the old man. He's the first thing right in the middle of the picture. Until that day, the king had ensured that the people of the palace, including the servants, were young and healthy as the prince himself. But the sight of an old man was shocking for Siddhartha. When the prince asked his servant what had happened to the old man, why does he look like this? His servant told him that aging happens to everyone, and it would happen to him one day too. Siddhartha reflected on this, saying, even though I was endowed with such fortune, such total refinement, the thought occurred to me. When an untaught, run-of-the-mill person, himself subject to aging, not beyond aging, sees another who is aged, he is horrified, humiliated, and disgusted, oblivious to himself that he too is subject to aging, not beyond aging. If I, who am subject to aging, not beyond aging, were to be horrified, humiliated, and disgusted on seeing another person who is aged, that would not be fitting for me. As I noticed this, the typical young person's intoxication with youth entirely dropped away. The second sight Prince Siddhartha saw was a sick man who was physically suffering because of his disease. And we can see him in the middle, sitting beneath this tree. You can see his body is very thin. He's very weak. When Prince Siddhartha asked his servant what had happened to the diseased man, why does he look like this? His servant told him that everyone outside the palace experiences illness, and that he would suffer illness too one day. Siddhartha reflected on hearing this. Even though I was endowed with such fortune, such total refinement, the thought occurred to me. When an untaught, run-of-the-mill person, himself subject to illness, not beyond illness, sees another who is ill, he is horrified, humiliated, and disgusted, oblivious to himself that he too is subject to illness, not beyond illness. And if I, who am subject to illness, not beyond illness, were to be horrified, humiliated, and disgusted on seeing another person who is ill, that would not be fitting for me. As I noticed this, the healthy person's intoxication with health entirely dropped away. And the third sight. The third thing Siddhartha saw was a corpse, which is how he learned that all life must eventually end in death. When the prince asked his servant what had happened to the dead man, what has happened to him? His servant told him that everyone must one day die, and that it would happen to him too. Siddhartha reflected on hearing this. Even though I was endowed with such fortune, such total refinement, the thought occurred to me. When an untaught, run-of-the-mill person, himself subject to death, not beyond death, sees another who is dead, he is horrified, humiliated, and disgusted, oblivious to himself that he too is subject to death, not beyond death. And if I, who am subject to death, not beyond death, were to be horrified, humiliated, and disgusted on seeing another person who is dead, that would not be fitting for me. As I noticed this, the living person's intoxication with life entirely dropped away. And finally, Siddhartha saw a holy man, an ascetic, a self-denier who refuses to eat or drink as a means of cultivating self-discipline and avoiding sin. Incidentally, in our first image, we do not see the holy man. We just see the first three sights, 1, 2, and 3. But the second image that I've provided, you can see the holy man. Furthest to the right, we have the old man, the sick man, the dead man, and the holy man. So again, Siddhartha saw a holy man, an ascetic, and learned that some people deny the comforts of this life for the sake of the next. The look of peace on the holy man's face told Siddhartha that physical comforts were not necessary for a happy life here on earth. So moved by what he saw, Siddhartha knew he could never go back to his old life. How could he eat rich food and sleep in comfort when people outside his window were cold and starving? Rejecting the life of royalty, he chose instead to find the best way to live, the way that provided the most happiness. According to another book of Buddhist scriptures, the Dhammapada, Siddhartha returned to his home in his father's palace after seeing the 4 sights outside. He arrived just in time for a performance of beautiful dancing girls, waiting to perform just for him, another of the many distractions Siddhartha's father had scheduled to entertain his son. But as beautiful as the girls were, and as pleasing as their dancing was, the prince's mind was preoccupied throughout their entire performance, and the thought of the things he had seen outside the city walls would not go away. After the performance, Siddhartha went to bed, and when he woke up a few hours later, he saw the dancers all asleep, helter-skelter on the floors and couches, their performance long over, and their skilled movements nowhere to be seen. So you can see Siddhartha on the stairs on the left side of the picture, and the dancing girls are just all lying on the floor. So the beauty of the dance has sort of given way to chaos. The contrast between the girls' earlier performance, choreography, and movement, and their careless, haphazard slumber, I would imagine some of the girls are snoring, which further contrasted with the lovely music Siddhartha had heard earlier, reminded Siddhartha that beauty, pleasure, and all the other good things are only temporary, and that the reality outside the city walls and after the performances for princes is less beautiful. This thought helped Siddhartha to realize that as good things, beauty and pleasure might be, these things only distract us from the suffering and chaos found in the world outside the palace walls, and that the people outside need help. For this reason, Buddhism rejects the idea that happiness can be found in the material world. It accepts that everything we see is an illusion, and thus that any fulfillment we find here will only be temporary. True happiness and satisfaction comes from the rejection of the things of this world, or at least coming to peace with the fact that there is ultimately nothing here for us. When we finally realize this and stop desiring the things that this world has to offer, then we are completely detached from this life. We will have found nirvana and will be free from life, materialism, and suffering at last. Siddhartha's time in his father's pleasure palace was over. It was time to go out in the world and make a difference. And of course, Siddhartha would become known as the Buddha. Thank you very much.